and what's going on in the legislature in regards to those things tonight. So thank you for joining us with NSEA. I'm Jenny Benson. I'm the president of NSEA. And with us tonight, we have Jason Hayes, who is our chief lobbyist and everything government relations at NSEA. We also have with us Maddie Finnell, who is our executive director. And of course, behind the scenes, it says NSEA staff 8, but that person is the person who runs all of these things and does a tremendous job is Kathy Chapman, who is our associate at NSEA that keeps everyone moving in the right direction. So Kathy won't show herself, but she's here with us and we really appreciate everything she does for us as well. And tonight we're going to be talking about funding and the things that are important. One of the things that, people talk about, I went and voted today in our city election, and it's just incredibly important for us to understand how things work. And when people tell us, I'm not political, we don't need to be political, we disagree with that. We believe that everything that happens within education is a decision that's made by policy and by political structure. And so we are happy to have with us tonight some very good friends of ours from two organizations that really work to help us to understand the financial aspect of it, and then also to advocate for the things that we need for our students and for our families in Nebraska. Tonight we have Craig Beck with us. He is OpenSky's fiscal analyst. And before joining OpenSky, Craig worked as a performance auditor in the legislature's Performance Audit Committee. That sounds like a bundle of fun. In that role, he analyzed and evaluated state policies and programs, including Nebraska's long-term care subsidies, tax incentives, and economic development programs. Craig has a master's degree in public administration from the University of Nebraska, Omaha, and a bachelor's degree in biosystems engineering from the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. Those are two quite different degrees. There's a story behind that, but we don't have time for that this evening. So Craig will be talking to us. And also with us tonight, we have Ann Hunter-Pirtle. She is the executive director and the founder of Stand for Schools. Ann is a Lincoln, Nebraska native and a proud graduate of Lincoln Public Schools and the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where she holds a BA in political science and French and an MS in agricultural economics. Prior to founding Stand for Schools, she spent 5 years in DC working at the US Senate, the White House, and the Environmental Protection Agency. Ann is passionate about preserving and strengthening Nebraska's public schools so that future generations of Nebraska can enjoy the opportunities she received. And I really appreciate that as a graduate of the university and public schools in Nebraska as well. This is why we do what we do, to make sure that our students and our families are provided for. And so I think we're going to start with Craig this evening. Is that correct? And Craig's going to give us a presentation, and Ann's going to give us a little presentation, and we're going to have questions and answers. So during this time, please chat. You can chat to a panelist. Maddie or Jason will be going through the questions. And then you also can write a question in the Q&A or raise your hand if you have something you want to ask. And go ahead and put your questions in there as they're happening. We may not stop the presenter right then, but at least you'll be remembering what it is. Oh yeah, I had a question about that, and that's perfectly okay. And trust me, when it comes to funding and TIOSA, nobody understands it all, and there is no dumb question, because you need to ask good questions to get to the root of what we're talking about in regards to the legislature and to funding. So please put your questions in there, chat to Maddie or Jason, and we will keep an eye on those. And Maddie and Jason will let me know if we need to stop and ask any questions, or they can jump in anytime as well. So Craig, the floor is yours.
Okay, we should have checked this, but my screen sharing is disabled. Am I able to get that, please?
So Kathy is the guru behind the scenes to share screen sharing privileges.
There we go.
And there you have it.
Great. Thank you, Kathy. I appreciate that. And thank you for that kind introduction, Jenny. So again, my name is Craig Beck and I'm the fiscal analyst at OpenSky Policy Institute. NSEA is a great partner and we always love working with NSEA and sharing our knowledge with them. So for those of you who don't know who OpenSky is, we are a nonpartisan think tank based in Lincoln, and we focus on tax, budget, and education finance policy in Nebraska. And so at OpenSky, the best choices are informed choices, and we work to make sure that lawmakers and other leaders have quality data and research to make decisions that help our communities thrive. So for my part of the presentation today, I'm going to go over a brief overview of TIOSA. I don't know if there's such a thing as a brief overview, but I'm going to try. And then I'm going to talk about, as Jenny said, some legislation that's currently in the pike in the legislature that we are watching for a potential impact on education funding in the state. So to begin with TIOSA, so TIOSA, or the Tax Equity and Educational Opportunities Support Act, is Nebraska's K-12 funding formula. It came to be in 1990 and is an equalization-based formula. And so the basic premise is needs minus resources equals equalization aid. It's a pretty complex formula containing many components, but the most basic description of it is this. Needs are what it costs a school district to educate its students. Resources are the revenue sources, like the taxable property within the district, that a school district can access in order to generate money for educating its students. And then equalization aid is the result when you take needs minus resources. So equalization aid is distributed by the state to help make up the difference, again, between the needs of a school district and its resources. And so if needs of a district are higher than its resources, a district gets equalization aid. So the basic concept of TIOSA has not changed since its inception, but that doesn't mean that the legislature hasn't tweaked it. Some of the changes involve things like trying to direct equalization aid to districts with needs like high transportation costs, high demand for special education, or a large number of students living in poverty. The formula is also often tweaked to balance the state budget, which mostly results in less state aid to schools. So schools get their funding from three sources: state funding, largely through the TIOSA formula, local funding, mostly through property taxes, and then federal funding. So Nebraska ranks very low among the states in terms of state support to education. In fact, we're 49th in the nation for state support for education. Conversely, we're also very high when it comes to local support for education, and we are in fact second highest in the nation for local support to schools. So the nature of the TIOSA formula is that as a district's resources go up, the smaller the difference between needs and resources becomes. That results in less to potentially no equalization aid for some school districts. And in 1990, for example, when TIOSA was passed, 90% of the state's districts received equalization aid. Currently, as of, I believe, school fiscal year 22, only about 34% of the state's districts will receive equalization aid, and that equates to about 84 of the 244 districts. So as a district's valuations, property valuations rise, as we've seen over the last 20 years for farmland in particular, districts lose and sometimes fall out of equalization. But just because a district doesn't receive equalization aid from the state does not mean that they are receiving any state funds. So all districts receive state funds, but not all districts receive equalization aid. And naturally, not all districts receiving that equalization aid does create some disparities. And those disparities, often become hot button issues. So there's been a push over recent years to rein in school spending. And there's the perception by some in the legislature that schools spend a lot. Our analysis of the matter shows that school spending is not the problem. Just some data to back that up really quick. From fiscal year 2007 to 17, school spending across the state averaged just 3.5% per year. State support is not only low, as I mentioned earlier, but it's also been declining as a share of the economy, which is another analysis that we often look at. So that analysis of ours shows that state support to schools was actually higher as a share of the economy in 1993 than it was in 2018. So people, particularly in the districts that have dropped out of equalization or never received it from the get-go, end up wanting property tax relief. But as I've hopefully illustrated, it's not because school spending is out of control. Rather, we're just fairly low on state support to schools. So the final thing that I would say before I get into describing the bills that we're watching this session is that there have been numerous attempts to review TIOSA, and those attempts haven't been all that fruitful, and I would say largely because the answer to the problem is to put more state funding into schools, which means most likely having a dedicated revenue source, and there's just not a ton of political will in the body to raise revenues. There's a bill this year that would create a commission to review the formula, and it would be very similar to the commission that brought TIOSA about in the late 1980s, and I believe that Anne is going to talk about that proposal later on. So the next section of my presentation deals with one of the ways that those actors in the body who may want to, attempt to rein in school spending, which, as I've hopefully illustrated, is not a huge problem. They are proposing, along with the governor's backing, a bill that would cap property tax for all local governments at asking at 3% over the prior year. It is not a spending cap or a budget limitation. And in reality, as we've seen, we've done a ton of analysis on this proposal. It could limit spending growth to well below 3% for some local governments, schools included. There are some exceptions, there are some exclusions. There are a couple ways that both governing bodies and people within the local subdivision can exceed the cap. But those are fairly technical, and I'm really not going to get into that right now unless somebody has a specific question. But as I said, we've done quite a bit of analysis on LB 408 and the impact that it would have, particularly on school districts, because when it comes down to it, we're really interested in how this would affect school districts. So one of the analyses that we did was we looked at 32 districts from 2017 to 2018. And the results were all over the board, very disparate, but mostly schools were losing money under the analysis. So, when we just look at magnitudes, there was a loss of almost $8 million in Millard to a potential gain of almost $1 million in Humboldt, Table Rock, Steinauer. I say potential gain because we're making an assumption there that Humboldt, Table Rock, Steinauer would have increased their property tax ask by 3% over the prior year, which they did not end up doing actually from 2017 to 2018. But when you look at percent of total receipts that schools lost or gained, you're looking at a potential of 40.2% receipts lost in Springfield Platteview under this analysis to almost 13% of total receipts gained in Humboldt, Table Rock, Steinauer, again, assuming that they levy up to the 3% that would be allowed under the cap. So before I move on from LB 408, I want to walk through a few examples looking at different sized school districts. And this analysis that we did looked at a 5-year time span. And I'm not going to walk through every number because it would take too long, but there's some themes that I want to point out here. So this is Wakefield. This is a small district, I believe, in northeast Nebraska. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong. So you'll notice in all of these examples that the actual property tax ask cumulative went up fairly significantly for these districts from 2013 to 18. At the same time, the state aid for those districts went down pretty precipitously as well. So here in Wakefield, they had a 62% cumulative property tax gain and a 62% state aid cumulative decline, for a total revenue growth of about 14.8% over that time, which I might add is less than 3% per year if you average it out. So under LB 408, Wakefield would have been capped at raising only 3% property tax from the prior year, but they still would have seen that 62% decline, in state aid, because, as I mentioned in my TIOSA overview, the state aid formula looks at a district's resources. So it's looking at the property valuation, and as valuations go up, state aid typically goes down. So under this scenario, again, Wakefield would have been capped at 3% a year on property tax asking. They still would have seen that big decline in state aid, and they actually would have had a negative total revenue growth from 2013 to 18 under LB 408. Here's a medium district, here's Ainsworth. Again, you'll see that fairly, large property tax increase, that again, significant state aid decrease, 91%, for a total revenue cumulative growth of just under 18%, which again is right around 3% a year. Under LB 408, they would have been capped at that 15.9% cumulative property tax growth. State aid still would have declined by more than 90%, and they would have been held to 5.2% cumulative revenue growth, which is just over 1% per year. So our fear with LB 408 is that it's really going to hamstring schools. And finally, this large district that we looked at was Kearney. Again, you'll see that pretty big increase in property taxes, that decline in state aid due to valuation increasing. Total revenue growth, roughly 19% actual. Under LB 408, though, they would have been held to total cumulative revenue growth of just 4.6%, which is less than 1% per year. So again, we're concerned about the effect that LB 408 would have on schools. Now, we have been told, so Senator Linehan, who's the chair of the Revenue Committee, held a news conference earlier this week or last week. I'm now getting my weeks mixed up, but she alluded to in the news conference that if LB 408 was going to impact state aid, that they would bring a fix. So we will wait to see, if they bring that fix. And Anne may have more information on that. Maybe she could talk about.
Almost like that's the point of the bill.
Right, and we're also watching for that fix potentially, because we think it would have a fiscal note attached to it, which is just an analysis done by the legislature that shows how much the proposal would cost. And we're assuming that a fiscal note on fixing TIOSA in this instance would probably be fairly significant. So we're keeping an eye on that. So now moving into some of the other proposals, again, that we're watching through the lens of, bills that have the potential to impact education funding. They're not necessarily education bills. They don't impact TIOSA directly, but what we're afraid of is that ultimately they're tax cuts and they reduce revenue. And when you don't replace revenue that you cut, we've seen time and time again that they come after education. TIOSA is the ultimate budget balancing tool. So there's the Appropriations Committee dropped their budget last week. It's coming up for debate this week on the floor. And they left just a little over $200 million for legislators to appropriate on the floor. All I really want to say here is that the Revenue Committee has advanced several significant bills that have a priority designation, which means that they're very likely to get debated, that have a very significant fiscal impact. So we're talking 300 million in the next budget cycle, almost 600 million in the following budget cycle. And then after that, an ongoing annual fiscal impact of approaching $400 million a year. And then there are also, other priority bills that have advanced from other committees with fiscal notes, but as you can see, those fiscal notes are quite a bit smaller. They're mostly one time. The ongoing annual impact of those other bills is just $22 million a year by our analysis. So the first proposal that I want to touch on is LB 432, which is an omnibus bill that the Revenue Committee put together. It contains, the theme of this omnibus is corporate tax cuts. So without boring you all with the specifics of corporate income tax, there's one bill that they amended in, which was LB 347, that would essentially erode the state's corporate tax base by taking off the ability for us to tax domestic profits held in overseas tax havens. So by doing this, the state would forego a fairly significant amount of revenue because of this long-standing method of tax avoidance by these corporations. Another portion of LB 432 comes from LB 680, which would lower the corporate
Craig,
income.
a quick question, if you don't mind.
Yeah, of course.
Didn't the Biden administration, Janet Yellen, just make an announcement around these whole corporate tax thing and these offshore? And isn't the Biden administration trying to do something to create like an international piece around all this? Do you know anything about that?
You know, I saw the article. I did not read it, and I don't know if there would be implications for the state. I mean, we are coupled to the federal tax code, so we would most likely, you know, follow anything that the federal government does to the tax code. But so this income in question is called GILTI, Global Intangible Low Tax Income. Here I am getting into the weeds, So Nebraska is looking, legislators are looking to remove that from taxation, from our tax code, is basically what it amounts to.
So you're saying they want no guilty taxes? Is that what I just heard you say?
Yes, that is correct. Yep. So again, there's another portion of the bill that would actually just reduce the state's corporate income tax rate to 6.84%, about 1% lower. We've had modeling done on this tax cut, and what it amounts to is the benefits of this tax cut would mostly flow, like 80+% would flow to out-of-state corporations and shareholders. So it would not even really benefit people here in the state. These are the other provisions that are contained in the LB 432 omnibus bill. But the point here that I want to make is that if this bill passes, it's going to reduce our revenue by about $150 million over the next 2 budget cycles. So again, anytime you're reducing revenue without a replacement, we're concerned that eventually when, you know, times may be okay right now, but when you continue doing that into the future, we're afraid they're going to come for education. So that's why we're watching this very closely. LB 595 is another omnibus bill. It creates a whole host of tax cuts and exemptions, and it would cost about $40 million over the next 2 budget cycles. So again, we're watching this closely because there's no revenue replacement for it. So LB 64 is another bill that we're watching pretty closely, and it would exempt all of the states, all of the state's retirees' Social Security income from taxation. Now, there's a couple things that I want to point out here. So the first thing is that it would phase in over time. It wouldn't become a full exemption until 2030. But the second point that I want to make here is that we again had modeling done on this proposal, and what it showed was that retirees in the top 20% of Nebraska incomes, so those are retirees with annual adjusted gross incomes of more than $114,000, would receive more than 2/3 of the tax cut once it is fully implemented. So, you know, just from a very basic perspective, I mean, we would be concerned that removing this revenue off the table would threaten funding for things like healthcare and other services that Nebraska retirees depend on. And it would end up costing about $140 million per year once it's fully implemented. And there is another bill that does not have a priority designation that's in the Revenue Committee. That's LB 237, and it would exempt Social Security income for seniors, retirees, of incomes up to $95,000 for married couples, and then $80,000 for single taxpayers. The fiscal note on that bill, once it's fully implemented, is about $100 million per year less than this 100% exemption of all Social Security income. So we support that more targeted approach because if you look at it, when that $100 million is going to those incomes above 95,000, it's largely going to high income people. And again, our modeling confirms that. So here's another bill that is actually focused on education that came out of the Revenue Committee. And this is LB 454, which is the School Property Tax Stabilization Act. And with an amendment that was filed, it would provide an influx of state K through 12 money that would be phased in over a 4-year period. And it would go to schools whose property tax requirement, after accounting for things like state aid and other funds, exceeds a set percentage of their needs, of what they need to educate students. So in fiscal year 22, which is the next fiscal year that will begin starting June 1st, the aid would go to districts whose property tax requirement exceeds 70% of their needs, and it would ratchet down to 55% by fiscal year 25, and it would stay at 55% each year thereafter. We don't oppose any funding going to schools, but what gives us heartburn on this bill is that, again, there's not a designated new funding source for revenue to pay for it. Our education policy analyst, who's Connie Kanoki, who's one of the best people in the state at TIOSA, has run a model on this, and she estimates that it'll cost about $83 million a year once it's fully implemented. Again, without a dedicated funding source, that makes us a little nervous, particularly when it comes to the equalization aid formula and getting money to the high need districts. And we're also a little concerned about LB 454 because we think that it's just gonna worsen the levy disparities that already exist between districts. And then one of the positive things is there's, I believe it's an amendment that states that if it passes, that the state will have to fully fund TIOSA before it will fund the Property Tax Stabilization Act. But again, this is something that we're watching. It's currently sitting on general file. So the next couple of bills that I want to talk about are property tax relief bills, LB2 and 79. LB2 would reduce the valuation of ag land to 50% for property taxes paid on bonds. So it would just reduce ag land to 50% for purposes of bonds. And then LB 79, which was amended on to LB2, would have the state's property tax credit program grow annually starting in 2024 by 3%. And that would be regardless of Nebraska's financial condition. Now, just to back up really quick, the property tax credit program is a program that was started, I believe, in 2007 by the legislature. It provides credit to property taxpayers. It provides a credit for property taxpayers on their property taxes based on their valuation, based on how much in valuation they own. It's currently set at $275 million a year, which is a fairly significant chunk, especially when we're talking about a $5 billion general fund budget for Nebraska. And we've done modeling on this as well. That 3% increase starting in 2024 is going to have a growing impact annually. And it's just going to end up costing the state more money in property tax relief. So we're watching this one really closely as well. The final bill that I want to touch on is actually a proposed constitutional amendment, and that's LR 11CA. It would implement a consumption tax. It was voted out of the Revenue Committee. And what what this proposal would do is it would constitutionally ban the state and all its political subdivisions from raising any type of tax. So it would eliminate property taxes, it would eliminate inheritance taxes, corporate income taxes, personal income taxes, sales taxes, all in favor of this consumption tax that would be paid for. You would pay a consumption tax on all goods and services that you bought and used in the state. There's a companion bill for it that calls for a 10.64% consumption tax rate. And the thing that I really want to point out here is that the fiscal note on that proposal shows that by fiscal year 2027, if it were to be implemented, it would cost the state $4 billion. So that means that it would eliminate about half of the state's entire tax collection by 2027 if it were to be implemented. So we're watching that very closely. We don't think that it has a very good chance of passing, but we are gonna keep our eye on it. So that is the end of my presentation. Really quickly, if you want to sign up for OpenSky updates, we send out policy briefs and keep people informed on the legislature. Please just go to our website and you can sign up there. So
I have a question about the constitutional amendment. Why did it get out of committee then? I don't understand why they would even get it out of committee with a $4 billion price tag.
Jason?
I think somebody got votes on, or probably promised Erdman some votes on some things to get it out. So some vote trading went on.
Yep.
What my understanding, Jenny, is that there was vote trading, and that some of the folks that agreed to vote for it in favor of whatever else they wanted thought that it didn't have the votes to get out of committee, but enough people did that suddenly it did. So that's
Yep.
right.
They all showed up to executive session and said, "Wait, you didn't vote for it, did you? Or you didn't trade a vote?" And
like,
6 of them said, "Yep."
Yes, because they were doing the trading and behind the scenes negotiating that, we are very familiar with behind the scenes ourselves, but I don't think a lot of people are very familiar with the things that are happening behind the scenes. And then with the bills that they're adding so many different things that have nothing to do with the bill onto the bill to get people to vote them out of committee or to at least get them on the floor. So thank you very much. I don't know if the question and answer was working. So if anybody has any questions, please raise your hand, or if anybody wants to say anything to Craig. Otherwise, we will move on to our next presenter. Thank you, Craig, for all your great information. I learned a lot. It's a little overwhelming for those of us who don't speak all of that language, but you did a really nice job of breaking it down for us. And that's super important.
Jenny, we do have a question.
Yay!
Beth Herget would like to know, how will gambling affect school funding?
That's a good question. So there's a bill in the legislature currently that would determine how that funding is allocated. I mean, I think it was stated in the constitutional amendment that just passed, but there's a bill that would codify that. And my recollection, and Anne may know, but I think 80%, I think it's 75 or 80% of the funding of the taxes that are generated from gambling would go to reduce property taxes, which is not education. But, we seem to be doing all these piecemeal bills around the edge of education funding. So I suppose there's a chance that I don't know. It's going to go to property tax relief. So.
All right. So we have, there's more questions. So Maddie's going to read them off there.
In regards to LB 408, what does state aid continue? Why does state aid continue to drop if property tax gets capped? Wouldn't schools need more aid?
Yeah, that's a really good point, and that's what we're watching.
Good point, Andrew.
Yes.
Way to go, AJ.
So that's the issue, right? And Renee Fry, who is our executive director, brought that point up to Senator Linehan, again, who's the chair of the Revenue Committee, in the hearing. Senator Linehan conceded to Renee that this was an issue where you're, there's a disconnect, right? Because the school's district's valuation is growing, they're losing state aid, but then the state is then coming in and saying, well, you can only raise 3% per year on the property taxes, where normally they would have to go to property taxes to make up that loss in state aid. So we were assured there'd be a fix. We didn't hear anything about it for a while. And then I guess it came up in I guess Senator Linehan mentioned it again in the press conference that she held last week. So.
Senator Linehan just loves it when Renee Fry points out her mistakes. Are there any TIF reform bills this year or oversight auditing bills similar to the past ones like 445 or 596?
There are. That is not my area, but I will say that today OpenSky had a budget briefing with Senator Anna Wishart, who's the vice chair of the Appropriations Committee, and she actually touched on those auditor bills. So I would direct you to that video.
Jason or Ann, did you have anything on either one of those you wanted to throw in?
Sorry.
I would just add in regards to LB 408 and the very good point that Andrew brought up. I mean, that's exactly the issue, to Craig's point, but I think also there's a perception among some senators and some folks in the public, I wouldn't say it's most folks, but I think there's a perception out there that schools can somehow absorb an unlimited amount of budget cuts and continue to provide the same quality of education, right? And that's just not true. You can't always just keep doing more with less. It's not possible. And so if something like 408 were to pass, you would see devastating cuts in most school districts across the state that would dramatically impact the quality of education that schools are able to provide. And if the legislature chooses to pass 408, they need to know that that's what they're choosing. So that's something that the folks on the panel work every day to make policymakers understand that
sorry, cat video.
Right, that this money isn't just like magically sitting in coffers, it's funding staff, it's heating buildings and paying for roof upgrades and all the things that schools need to do. And so when policymakers choose tax cuts without backfilling the funding from any source, then there are these awful trade-offs. And they need to understand that that's what they're choosing.
And they don't really take into consideration then any kind of cost, cost of living and just in general that things go up, and I heard that they talked about that today when you mentioned Anna Wishart in the budget hearing, or that they talked about the budget conversation. Is that on OpenSky's website?
It is. I don't know if it's up right now, but it will be.
Okay. Yeah, that gave a lot of really good information from appropriations. We're talking a lot of revenue committee,
Right.
But it was all about appropriations and the budget and those kind of things. And she did say something very similar to what Ann just said about you can't keep expecting to have quality programs and then give all these cuts just across the board, whether it be health and human services or education or any of the programs that we need to continue to have this good life, in Nebraska as well. So thank you very much. Maddie?
One more
We had
question.
one more question. Oh,
Yeah, actually, is there any indication, anybody got a crystal ball and you want to say what's going to happen on April 29th when the forecasting board comes out? Anybody have any idea of how we're going to look there? Because that does impact the budget.
Yeah. I actually got this question in an earlier presentation today too. So, I mean, the February forecast was pretty good. It raised revenues this year by more than 200 million, and it raised revenues for the next biennium by more than 250 million. Nebraska, all economic indicators, especially coming out of the pandemic, are pretty good. We've actually weathered it pretty well. I mean, we've had a significant amount of federal funding that has come into the state, but I don't really think we're seeing anything that would lead to a drastic change. either direction in the April forecast. So.
And you mentioned the federal funding. I just want everyone on the call to know that NSEA has assigned a staff person who is Brian Mickelson, who normally works all our campaigns and candidates. And now his new campaign is federal dollars and where are they going? And so Brian is doing all the research on this and staying ahead of it. And we'll be, he's attended several webinars. And so we'll be offering more information on this because there is a ton of money, $775 million plus probably, that are flowing into the state, and it's going to be flowing to school districts. And on her call 2 weeks ago, I think it was, with local presidents, Jenny said, one of the things every local should be doing is thinking about what 3 top things do they want with that money. And even before we know what everybody's going to get and how it's going to flow and when it's going to flow, start talking about what would you use the money for, so that you're making good choices with the money and not, my concern is if we're not paying attention, suddenly everybody's going to have a $10,000 a day expert providing PD in their school district. So we want to make sure that we are looking at where those dollars are going and that they're being used wisely for schools. Carol Dennison would like to know, doesn't this sound like the same squeeze on schools and other state obligations that Kansas went through? Our governor listens to Kansas too much, but I'll let you guys go ahead and chat about that.
Yeah.
You want to take that one, Ann?
Sure. Yeah, Carol, it's absolutely that. And I think the main difference is, and this is something that folks who might be inclined to want to follow the Brownback model have learned in the last 10 years, is that Governor Brownback in Kansas announced this experiment with a lot of fanfare and press conferences and a lot of like pointing to, look at all the tax cuts we're doing and look how they fit together as packages. And what we're seeing in Nebraska and elsewhere, there are now dozens of states that have experienced something like the Kansas experiment. But the difference is that it's kind of happening everywhere all at once. As we all know, our news cycle has changed. There's a lot more sort of happening and craziness going on at the federal level that tends to dominate the news cycle. And so it's just not being covered in the same way that the Kansas experiment was 10 years ago. So yes, absolutely. It's something very similar. It's a little slower and it's more akin to death by 1,000 cuts. But yes, absolutely, we've seen this story before.
Yeah, and I would say just be on the lookout for tax reform, even more bigger tax reform next year. So.
Thank you very much, Craig. And thanks for the great questions as well. Keep them up. And now, Ann, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll dive in, starting sort of where Craig left off, and that's with LB 132, which is the TIOSA study that Senator DeBoer introduced this year, and that for the first time has actually made it out of the Education Committee and has been prioritized by the Planning Commission. So when TIOSA came into existence in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a 2-year extensive study that led up to its creation. And as part of that study, the state hired, in the late 80s, they spent a few $100,000 on some national experts who were able to advise on kind of what other states were doing, what the national picture looked like around how states were coming up with funding formulas. And there was also a citizen advisory panel that was assembled, made up of folks from education and agriculture and business primarily, to talk about what the needs were in the state and what the vision was for education in the coming decades. I think in a lot of ways, TIOSA has served us remarkably well, and in some ways, it at least tries to get state dollars to where they're needed most. And I think that is a very admirable goal. Equalization as kind of a guiding principle for our school funding formula is something that's really important. Where it has fallen short is that it was never designed to take wild swings in land valuation into account, like we've seen in rural Nebraska in the last 10 years. And so, you've had, as Craig outlined, a lot of rural districts whose, land valuations more or less doubled overnight in a lot of places. and suddenly they lost their state aid because the formula was never made to take that kind of swing into account. It just hadn't happened before in that way. And so I think almost everyone would agree that the formula needs updating. I think and it's encouraging, it's something that folks in the education community, including Stand for Schools and NSEA and OpenSky and others have been pushing for many years. It's exciting to finally see that bill out of the education committee. My big concern is making sure that whatever study is undertaken and whatever eventual formula is arrived at improves equity rather than decreases it. And I think that's a real risk with this legislature. And if you're only, looking at things from a very limited perspective, I think there is that risk that the neediest students do worse in a successive formula to TIOSA than they're doing now. And that's what we need to prevent from happening. So that said, it's exciting that the study bill has come out of the education committee, like I said, and I think there's a recognition, there have been a few efforts over the last several years to dramatically redesign the TIOSA formula, just sort of written one-off willy-nilly by like one senator or a couple of senators. And this is too big an issue for one person to try to tackle alone. You just can't, as a single individual, regardless of how open-minded you might think you are, you can't capture all the perspectives in the whole state that are going to be affected by this funding formula for decades to come. And so the first step that's really important is getting the Citizen Advisory Committee together and laying out a process for some type of national experts to come in and advise. And that's what LB 132 does. So it's exciting that it's out of committee. There are certainly some opportunities and also some risks there. So that's something that we'll be watching closely, this year into next year. I also want to touch on LB 364, which is Senator Linehan's scholarship tax credit bill. I'm going to share a fact sheet here if I can real fast. One moment. Okay. So this is just kind of a fact sheet that's obviously wordy that covers a lot about LB 364. The basics are that it is a scholarship tax credit bill introduced by Senator Linehan, the chair of the Revenue Committee. And what it would do is it essentially would allow donors to private school scholarship funds to make those donations to private educational entities in lieu of paying up to half their income taxes. And then it would distribute those funds as scholarships for lower income students to attend private schools. Lots of problems with this bill. Ignore this chart for now because there's an amendment that changes this component of the bill. But I do want to note, so the fact sheet I have up here pertains to the original bill as it was introduced. There's since been an amendment that would limit the spending in the bill to $5 million a year and would tie in some child care tax credits to the bill. So they've essentially combined two bills. They combined LB 364 with LB 531, which is like I said, a child care tax credit bill. And even with those changes, there are still a lot of problems with this bill. So I want to walk through those. I do want to point out though, in the underlying bill here, LB 364 would have cost $10 million in its first year and would have likely grown at 25% per year, every year with no ultimate cap. So within 10 years, you would have been looking at nearly $100 million a year going to private school scholarships under LB 364. Something that's really concerning about this is that the bill didn't grow based on the number of students who wanted a scholarship. It grew based on the number of donors who wanted that tax credit. And why that's important is this. In other states that have programs like LB 364, have tax credits like this, very often those credits are snapped up immediately when they become available on January 1st, because they're a very, very generous dollar for dollar tax credit on a donation that you make. So if you're a wealthy person or corporation looking to reduce your tax burden, this is the best possible way to do it. No other type of charitable giving is favorized in this way in Nebraska. If you make a donation to a church or a food bank or cancer research, you get a charitable giving deduction on your taxes, but you do not get a dollar for dollar tax credit. And so we're really giving special treatment in LB 364 to this one type of charitable giving, something that we don't do for any other category of charity. We think that's a problem. And in addition, we have concerns that LB 364 does not protect children from discrimination. It does not require private schools to accept all students the way public schools do. Under the bill, and this is still true in the amendment, private schools can discriminate. Their only prohibition on discrimination is overt discrimination based on race. No other category is protected. So religion, sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, English language learner status, refugee status, none of those students are protected. The bill says in black and white that just because a student is eligible for a scholarship does not mean that, that a private school has to take them. Some information here, and I'll just walk through it quickly on how these kinds of tax credit scholarships have played out in other states. In Arizona, this program began at $10 million a year in 2007, and it's nearly at $100 million now. So I should say that the recent amendment to LB 364 does limit it to $5 million a year, but it's been reintroduced in the same form a number of years in a row, and the introduced version is always starting at $10 million a year, growing 25% a year with no cap. So it's really clear to me that supporters of the bill, that's their ultimate goal. Even when they've amended it down in previous years, it has gone back up in later versions of the bill. And so something that I'm going to work really hard to make sure that legislators understand is that passing a $5 million tax credit this year is not going to be the end of the story if they were to go down that road. There would be efforts every year to increase that amount of funding.
And isn't that typical in other states for sure, right? That's exactly what's happened. They have a cute little ad out right now that we're one of 3 states that doesn't have this. But if you look at the other 47 that do, there are some major issues with it, but they don't say that. Yeah,
absolutely. To that point, Jenny, in Georgia, there was a 2013 report by the Southern Education Foundation that found that tens of millions of taxpayer dollars in Georgia have been diverted illegally from the state treasury. So what happens when...
Oh, I'm sure we would have no problem like that here, Ann, because our auditing department has done so well when it comes to things like, oh, you know, foster care and even just watching the bills in general. Sorry, I just couldn't stay silent.
No, completely. I mean, and this report found that the Georgia program was, quote, virtually unregulated and unaccountable for how hundreds of millions of tax dollars have been spent. What happens when there are more donors who want a tax credit than students who want a scholarship is that students start getting multiple scholarships from different scholarship granting organizations, which is allowed under the current language of LB 364. And what starts to happen as well is that, you know, some private school administrators, certainly not all, but some, start to use that money to line their own pockets. They start buying fancy cars, you know, updating their kitchens.
Credit card charges that aren't explained. Yeah.
So there's no public
Exactly.
accountability. And somebody put in the question or in the Q&A, where's the megaphone to help connect the dots between the lack of state funding for K-12 schools and high local property taxes? What's the disconnect? How come people can't see this that seems so clear, especially when you guys present it so well tonight?
Yeah.
They don't want to know.
I think the most honest answer I can say is that there are some folks in power who have a very vested interest in refusing to see that connection and in spinning a false narrative that school spending is the problem. And, you know, all of the panelists on this call work every day to dispel that. And, you know, it's something we say over and over as you need to for any type of public communication. You know, it takes something like 7 times of somebody hearing a message for them to maybe remember it once. So it's largely a matter of repetition, but it starts with knowing the facts. So that's something that you all who are listening in can share and share with your, you know, your local elected officials and your state senator that you know.
And your people
You know,
at church and the people in the
right.
grocery store line and the
Right.
people in your clubs and your family across the state. When people don't understand, and again, I started out by saying, oh, we don't want to talk about politics. Guess what? Property taxes are politics. You know, school funding, politics. School, you know, but they love their local schools. They love their local schools across Nebraska. I mean, I would say we're top in the nation for that. But whoever said that is correct. There's a huge disconnect between we want this school to stay in Taylor to Nebraska, and we will vote to not consolidate, and we will keep paying those taxes. But then when you go to the legislature, make sure you lower my taxes.
Right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. Well, and what's so interesting is, you know, there's been polling year after year showing that a huge majority of Nebraskans support their local public schools. You know, things like bond issues and levy overrides tend to do pretty well in Nebraska most of the time, even in pretty conservative communities. And I think what that tells us is that when it comes to, you know, our local schools, people are only too happy, not everyone, but most people, as evidenced by how these ballot initiatives turn out, most people are only too happy to tax themselves more to pay for the education that they know kids need. Just a couple other items I want to highlight, and that is that in many states that have vouchers or so-called opportunity scholarships, these tax credit scholarships, students who attend private school using the scholarship perform worse than their public school counterparts. And there are, I think, a lot of reasons for that. In Louisiana, for example, if the schools participating in the Louisiana Scholarship Program were their own school system, it would be the 5th worst school system in the state in terms of achievement. And the reason is this. If you think about some of the really high quality private schools that have existed in Nebraska for a long time, you know, they've done okay without state funding. And if we were to create this type of scholarship program, some of those really high quality, long-lasting private schools might take a few students on this type of scholarship, but they wouldn't need to take very many because, like I said, a lot of them have been doing all right. But what happens is the value of the scholarship is less than it actually costs to attend a high quality private school. And so what has happened in state after state, Wisconsin is a great example, Indiana, Louisiana, certainly, is that lower quality sort of fly-by-night private schools have opened up as soon as the money became available just to take advantage of those funds. And those schools have provided a lower quality education than is available in public schools. Meanwhile, public schools are getting defunded and the quality of education available there declines over time. because as we discussed, you can't just continue cutting public schools and expect the same quality of results. That's not how it works.
Sorry, Ann.
Oh, go
I
ahead.
know we're
Go ahead,
running
Craig.
up against time here, but I do just want to make one point. When Ann said dollar for dollar tax credit, I just want to give a quick example of what that means. So if, let's say, somebody were to give a $10,000 donation to a public school foundation, the maximum benefit that they would get, as Kazan said, it's a deduction, would be $684, which that's the top tax bracket in the state, 6.84%. This LB 364 would provide a dollar for dollar tax credit. So that $10,000 donation to a scholarship granting organization is worth $10,000 to that individual, whereas the donation to the public school foundation is only worth $684.
Yes,
So we have
thank
nothing
you,
like
Craig.
this.
Or the donation
Absolutely.
to the Cancer Society,
Right.
or the donation to a
Right.
food bank,
Yes.
or the any other, this is completely
NSEA's Children's Fund.
the NSEA
Right.
Children's Fund. Exactly, none of that.
Or your church.
Right.
Or your
Nothing-
church, or your,
Nothing.
I mean, that is important information. $684 deduction versus a dollar for dollar tax credit on your income tax.
Thank you
Correct.
for making that distinction, Craig. That's a really
So the
important
rich get
point.
richer, and this
Right.
isn't about poor kids at all. This
And
is
that-
about other things.
Right. And the other thing that's pretty wild about LB 364, as I said, this current amendment caps the program initially at $5 million a year. There's nothing to prevent a single individual or corporation that has at least $10 million in income tax liability to wipe out that entire $5 million credit for themselves. So they could make a $5 million contribution to a private scholarship granting organization and get the entire, statewide credit for themselves. There's nothing preventing that in this bill.
Jason,
So-
did you have something? Jason?
Well, I
thought
was
you
just
were
going to say, that $684 is only if you get the full credit for your deduction as well. So it could,
Mhm,
typically would even be less than $684.
mhm.
True. Thank you.
That's right. The other thing that we found across the country with programs like this is that over time, most of the scholarships end up going to students who would have attended private school anyway. Basically, in the bill as written, they're available either to, I believe it's kindergartners or ninth graders, or anyone who has been in a public school the previous semester. So there's nothing stopping a family who wants some help paying for private school to take their kid out of their existing private school, send them to public school for one semester, and then they are eligible for the scholarship. It's just not targeted to the folks that proponents say it is. There is an argument out there that somehow these tax credit scholarships are not going to hurt public school funding. And I think that talking point comes from the fact that it's true, this money is not coming directly out of the TIOSA formula. It's coming out of the state's general fund. But the general fund is what the state uses to pay for everything, including public education. And so money that goes to private schools under LB 364 has to come out of the state budget somewhere else. And whether that's public education or health and human services or public safety, it absolutely will have budget implications. And especially if it later grows to the levels that its proponents clearly intend, if you're looking at hundreds of millions of dollars a year at some point, you can't tell me that that's not going to impact public school funding. That's a really disingenuous argument, I think. We've touched on that overall tax credit scholarships do not improve academic outcomes, that private schools can and do discriminate against children, those who they open their doors to. And this isn't to hate on private schools. I mean, we've got some great private schools in Nebraska, but when your funding is independent, then in my book, that's that's great. Do whatever you want, more or less. But at the point at which you've got public dollars involved, and the notion that these schools would still not take all comers, that doesn't sit right. And there's also an argument out there that tax credit scholarships somehow save the state money by taking kids out of public schools. And that's just not true. You would need so many students to leave a single public school to actually see any savings, that it's just unlikely. If 2 students leave an elementary school under this program, one in grade 2 and one in grade 4, you still need the same number of teachers, still going to cost the same to heat and cool the building and keep the lights on and do the maintenance. You're not going to see cost savings unless there is some type of mass exodus that just doesn't tend to happen in states that have these kinds of tax credits. So it's a dangerous bill, certainly one we're watching closely, and it's sort of the camel's nose under the tent, right? So I don't know how we're doing for time. There's one other bill I could cover, or if we want to
You can go ahead.
questions.
That's fine.
Okay. The other bill to touch on is LB 681, which is also a revenue committee bill. It has not come out of committee at this point and has not been prioritized. So this one is less likely to be debated on the floor than the other two, but want to just point it out because it does represent a threat, we believe. So what it would do is make 529 college savings accounts usable for K-12 private tuition. So 529 college savings accounts are savings accounts that anyone can open, and they're intended, they're tax advantaged. So if you put money in, you don't pay taxes on it. And they're intended to incentivize long-term saving for college. And they can be used for a range of educational expenses, not just room and board and tuition, but laptops and books and a range of other types of higher ed expenses. And again, the time factor is the reason why those accounts are tax advantaged. The argument for them is, we want to encourage people to start saving early for their kids' higher education. I think the problem with these accounts is that you have to have money to save to use them at all. So the people who benefit tend to be fairly high income, and that is what it is. These accounts have existed for some years. In 2017, there was federal tax reform that allowed but did not require states to let folks use these 529 college savings accounts for K-12 private tuition. And the problem with that is it turns these savings accounts into just a pass-through where you could, put in a few $1,000s on December 31st of a given year, turn around and withdraw that entire amount on January 1st, the next day, and get the full tax benefits that you would have gotten for saving for college. And so it in our view, it negates the reason why these accounts are tax advantaged in the first place, and it decreases the amount of tax revenue that's available to the state because, again, these accounts are tax advantaged. So, and same thing, even more so for something that's quick turnaround, like these accounts, or like LB 681 is envisioning. You have to have money immediately to save to take advantage of these accounts at all. So, it's not helping the lowest income families pay for school because folks who are not able to put money away in a savings account can't take advantage of the benefits. So it's just another way of trying to get in the door for school privatization. Again, the bill hasn't been prioritized yet, but it's one we're continuing to watch closely.
Yeah, we always are trying to keep an eye on all those shell games, where they are trying to move fast and don't pay attention. And I just, I'm so pleased that Stanford Schools and OpenSky help us to understand these things so that we can share that information out as well, and have our members understand that then their voice is important. And like I said, your family's voice, the people that are out there to understand this. And it is all about this wealthier getting wealthier, and the rest of us kind of just like either status quo or going down, because that's what it looks like for everybody. And I think that everything we talked about tonight are just about that shell game, moving money around, and really not seeing, the benefit. And we know that our investment in public schools is an investment in our future of Nebraska, and we really appreciate that. We put a lot of links in the chat as well. We have an action alert on our site. Looking at what we have right now, Craig and Ann, what's coming up first that we need to really focus on, and then what's coming up next, as far as like, if we're getting people that we're talking to involved in things, what is it we should tell them, because I know legislators are busy and they have a lot on their plate, but we can't bombard them with information that is not right now, because they're just going to not pay attention to it. What do you think?
So Anne may have a little more information on this than I do, but it is my understanding that LB 408, which are the property tax caps, are going to come up after the budget. So potentially next week or the week thereafter, and Jason might have a better sense too. And then those tax and spending bills we've heard are going to be after LB 408.
So the budget is going to be debated Thursday of this week in the first round. And then, I've heard the week of April 19th or so I'm not sure where maybe LB 408 falls next week. And some of those further bills like 364 and others the week of April 19th. So that's kind of the rough timeline as far as we understand it.
I think all the fireworks are going to be on the week of April 19th. So
We don't have anything going on that week, so it's all good. Oh yeah, we do. Our delegate assembly is that week, so we will be around a lot of people during that week. So I think that's important for us to know that, because we're having a lot of pre-meetings and to get ready for our delegate assembly. So we will definitely be talking about that, and that few hundred people that will be joining us via Zoom will be hearing this as well. So and we will also share the video with some folks. We won't be posting it. Maddie said some things you guys didn't, but Maddie did. No, I'm kidding. That we don't want for the whole world to see, but we will share this and that information. And we did really well. It's 8:14. And we kept it really close. We know that the people that are on, that are classroom teachers, have been working their tails off this year. And our staff that's on have been working their tails off to help them as well. And our retired members are doing that too. So we just want to, thank them for taking the time to be with us tonight. We thank you all for being with us as well. And we will definitely be in touch. And if we can do anything to help your organizations in the future, please let us know. But thank you very much, friends, for joining us. And we will be in touch. And if you haven't signed up for the Capitol update, you need to do so. Maddie put that link in there. Maddie or Jason, do you have anything to say for the good of the good?
No, just follow the Capitol updates, and we'll tell you how to get a hold of your senator.
Perfect.
Thanks to Ann and Craig.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Good night,
you all.
friends.
Thank you.
Good night.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.